Please be advised that this recorded webinar has been edited from its original format, which may have included a product demo. To set up a live demo or to request more information, please complete the form to the right. Or if you are currently not on CSC Global, there is a link to the website in the description of this video. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning for those of us joining in the States. So I want to say welcome to today's webinar, The Inside Look at AML Regulations, a Client and Investor Perspective. My name is Linda Kenny, and I'm the Compliance and Risk Lead within European Fund Services at CSC, and I will be your moderator. So to introduce our panel of speakers joining us today, we have Hazel O'Flynn in her capacity as Independent Non-Executive Director. We have Sarah Riley as a partner in the financial services team within Mason Hayes Curran Irish law firm. And we have Laura Wadding as a partner in Deloitte Ireland's risk advisory team. So I think on that basis, we will start actually with Hazel's slide as she'll go through and cover the director's governance perspective in relation to that.
Great. Thank you, Linda, and welcome everyone. I'm going to look at anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism from the perspective of the board of the fund. So taking a look at the current environment and what are the AML risks and threats that the fund board are exposed to. So, generally, globally and in Ireland specifically, the frequency and complexity of financial crime is increasing. Criminals involved in money laundering, terrorist financing, cybercrime are all becoming more sophisticated, and often they have significant resources behind them. Unfortunately, the COVID pandemic has played into the hands of all this and proved an extremely advantageous breeding ground for criminal opportunities. So to counter all of these threats, there has been increased regulation. In recent years, we saw the fourth EU anti-money laundering directive, which widened the scope of the entities subject to the AML and CFT requirements. It restricted the use of the simplified customer due diligence, and it broadened the definition of politically exposed persons, as we just talked about, who are subject to enhanced customer due diligence. Building on this, we've recently seen, and Sarah's going to talk to it in a few minutes, the fifth EU AML directive, which again widens the scope of the entities subject to the AML requirements. It now includes virtual asset service providers bringing cryptocurrencies into the net, and also art dealers. Again, the enhanced due diligence procedures were broadened to now apply to high-risk countries. So, all we see here is a trend of a broadening of definitions and broadening of scope of entities. There was also provision for enhanced powers for Ireland's Financial Intelligence Unit and greater cooperation between IFUs across the EU. Another hugely significant change in the regulations, which we've just spoken to as well, was the introduction of the beneficial ownership registers. So, as a director, obviously the increased regulation is a positive thing, but, it presents a risk and a challenge as well, because you need to make sure you're staying up to date with all of the changes in regulation and ensure that the funds are adhering to all of those changes in the regulation. And then it brings us on to, who enforces that regulation. So in Ireland, the central bank is the authority responsible for the supervision and enforcing of the regulations. The CBI has stated that the fight against money laundering and terrorist financing is one of its strategic priorities. And over the last number of years, there's been an increase in the number of on-site AML CFT inspections. The sanctions available to the CBI include fines and imprisonment. Enforcement actions we've seen quite a few high profile CBI fines over the last number of years for AML breaches, and there's a personal risk to a director here. In the Criminal Justice Act, it specifies that where an offence under the Act is committed with the consent or knowledge or willful neglect of a director, then that person is also deemed to have committed the offence and may be proceeded against and punished accordingly. So, we've talked about the threats, the risks, the things that are keeping directors up at night. So what are the tools that we have to address those or mitigate them, at least? So how I look at it is there's three lines of defence. The fund delegates AML, the day-to-day AML activities, to the fund administrator via the fund admin agreement, and the SLA. So the activities the admin usually carries out are the customer due diligence. Each investor is risk assessed by the admin, which determines the level of required CDD. simplified for a lower degree of risk. And, you know, where this is used, just this justification of using this simplified needs to be recorded. Standard or enhanced, as we spoke about, you know, that's now expanding to the PEPs and the high-risk countries, and making sure it's used in all the instances that it should have been. Also, the admin is carrying out transaction monitoring. You know, they generally use pretty sophisticated automated systems, and this is an area where technology can really come to the fore in AML, and, you know, AI can be adopted and all the rest. And, you know, through transaction monitoring, then suspicious transactions are identified. They're reported to the MLRO, who then reports to the FIU and the revenue commissioners. So, you know, as a director, again, you're getting quarterly reporting from the fund administrator. Then the MLRO will sort of oversee the activities of the fund administrator. How I see it is there's 4 main deliverables of the MLRO. One is the annual AML business risk assessment, and Laura will go into this in more detail, I think. But, you know, you need to consider customer risk, the country or geographic risk of the customer, the products or services or transactions in question, and the channel and distribution risk, you know, the extent of non-face-to-face interactions, the extent of the use of intermediaries. So this is obviously a big piece of work, and with all of your reporting that you receive from the admin and the MLRO, it needs to be analysed in detail and challenged. You know, that's the role of the board. The other task that the MLRO will carry out is the annual site visit for the admin. So, you know, overseeing that work, but in a detailed manner and a detailed report as a result of that site visit. An annual review of the policies to make sure they're up to date for new regulations, and annual training for all directors and all staff. And this is, you know, again, what I see then as the third pillar of defence for directors. So making sure that you are up to date. That annual training, now the CBI has specified it must actually involve an assessment, and that needs to be recorded. So, you know, with all of those tools, the board need to obviously ensure that there are robust policies and procedures at the fund level to prevent and detect money laundering and terrorist financing. Those policies need to be continuously monitored, that they are being applied correctly. And then there needs to be frequent review and updating of those policies and procedures to ensure that they remain fit for purpose. So back to you, Linda.
Thanks. That was very informative, and I definitely think you touched on the main aspects from an oversight perspective with the engagement of the different parties in reporting and making sure it's up to date and transparent. So with that, Sarah, I think you're going to pick up on some of those themes from a legislative perspective, particularly with the recent transposition of the 5th AML Directive fully in Ireland.
Thanks, Linda, and hello, everyone. As you all know at this stage, less than 2 weeks ago, on the 23rd of April, the Criminal Justice Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Amendment Act 2021 finally transposed the 5th AML Directive into Irish law. The implementation of the directive was actually long overdue. Ireland was fined €2 million last July by the European Court of Justice for delays in implementing the directive. So the good news is that at last it is finally in force in Ireland. Looking now to the main highlights of the Act, as you can see on the screen, there are 6 key points I wanted to highlight. Turning to each in turn, firstly, under the Act, 4 new designated persons have been added. As Hazel has mentioned, virtual asset service providers, high-value art dealers, and also letting agents and tax advisors. The most significant change introduced by the Act is the extension of the AML CFT regime to virtual asset service providers, such as crypto and blockchain businesses. All virtual asset service providers will now need to register with the Central Bank for EML CTF purposes. In order for the Central Bank to approve such an application, the Central Bank must be satisfied that its policies and procedures are effective in combating the risks of money laundering and terrorist financing associated with its business model and also its management and beneficial owners are fit and proper. The Central Bank will maintain a register of virtual asset service providers. And just to note that there is a 3-month transition period for virtual asset service providers already established in Ireland. There are new enhanced customer due diligence requirements when dealing with customers in high-risk countries. The new additional measures that need to be applied involve obtaining additional information on the customer and beneficial owner, their sources of wealth and sources of funds, the intended nature of the business relationship, and the reason for the transaction. There's also a requirement to obtain senior management approval for establishing or continuing the business relationship, and requirements for conducting enhanced monitoring. In terms of the hot topic, beneficial ownership, as we mentioned in our poll, there are new requirements for beneficial ownership checks. Prior to the establishment of a business relationship, a designated person is required to check that information relating to the beneficial owner of a customer is entered into the relevant beneficial ownership register. However, a financial institution can open an account for a customer before conducting these checks, but it can't carry out any transactions for the customer. There are new requirements around the verification of the identity of senior managing officials. Where a beneficial owner is a senior managing official, necessary measures must be taken to verify the identity of that person and keep records of the actions taken, including any difficulties encountered in the verification process. The Act has also introduced amendments to the PEP requirements, permitting a designated person to continue to monitor someone who was previously a PEP, provided a risk is still posed by that person, and only until they are no longer considered a risk. The Act also widens the definition of PEP to include any individual performing a prescribed function. And under the Act, the Minister for Justice, with the consent of the Minister for Finance, is empowered to issue guidelines to the competent authorities in relation to functions in the state considered to be prominent public functions. The defence of tipping off has been amended to make provision for the sharing of information relating to suspicious transactions in group situations. In terms of electronic money and anonymous safe deposit boxes, the value limits for carrying out CDD on e-money instruments such as prepaid cards has been lowered from 250 to 150 euros. There is now a prohibition on credit or financial institutions from creating anonymous safety deposit boxes. So in terms of next steps, the Central Bank has confirmed it will update and republish its guidelines, its AML CTF guidelines for the financial sector to take account of the changes. So all firms impacted by these changes will need to assess their business and update their policies and procedures to take account of the new requirements under the Act. In addition, virtual asset service providers will need to review their AML CTF frameworks to ensure that they will be in a position to comply with the new requirements and also be ready to submit their application for registration to the Central Bank before the end of the 3-month transition period. So I'll hand back now to Linda.
Thanks, Sarah. I think that was very informative on the new aspects and the widening of aspects to consider as part of the 5th AML directive. So Laura has a deep knowledge on the risk management structures and is probably quite familiar with a lot of people on this call. And she's going to go into a lot more detail on both the European and Irish standpoints, which she'll share with us now.
Thanks a lot, Linda. I always worry how well people on the call know me, not how well I know them. So, and so for anyone who is familiar with me, that they'll know that I've worked in this space now for a long time. And when I mean a long time, I think I wrote my first AML policy back in 2000, I want to say, and I think we were still working to the 1995 legislation that have been updated a couple of times and really haven't been embedded. And so that's how far back I go with this. And actually, And it's fair to say that in Ireland we have done a pretty good job over the years of managing things from a regulatory compliance perspective. And we've always stayed close to the regulatory developments, stayed close to the directives. To some extent, industry has been ahead of policy setters with regard to the implementation and anticipation of how some of those rules might change. And we've certainly adapted to that enhanced regulatory framework over the years, without a doubt. And I would say the one thing that I have noticed over the last few years is that actually the regulator's focus has shifted a little bit from regulatory compliance when it is engaging with its supervised firms. It has shifted from regulatory compliance to risk management. And for anyone who's been on the receiving end of a central bank themed inspection, they will be very familiar with this, particularly in the last 2 years, I would say. Maybe longer, because the last year for me is a bit of a blur, so we could be talking 3 years at this stage. And so what we're seeing when the central bank engages with firms is really focused on, number one, the business-wide risk assessment, which has already been mentioned. And what they expect to see is that the firm has developed and implemented a methodology that's appropriate to its business to assess the risk across the business. And not just and that's not just an exercise that's done once and then dropped and then picked up again in a year's time, but actually that it's a tool to manage financial crime risk in the business, including the terrorist financing risk, which can sometimes have different types of criteria that you might use to assess. And what it expects to see, and I've seen this in so many RMPs now at this stage, like a business-wide risk assessment. If it's a Word document that says we believe the risk to our business of money laundering and terrorist financing is low, that's unlikely to pass effective. It's, there's intended to be metrics in there to look at the geographic risk, the product risk, the distribution risk, the customer risk. There should be quantitative assessments and qualitative. It should give rise to a correlation to the risk appetite statement that's been set by the board. And if the residual risk turns out to be higher than the risk appetite, then there needs to be an action plan to bring that residual risk to within risk appetite. And it's intended to be a tool like that is used by the business. And the policies and procedures are expected to be derived from that and to make reference to it. So the policies and procedures, for them to be truly risk-based, should reflect the business-wide risk assessment. The customer risk assessment should be embedded in the business-wide risk assessment, and the regulator will look to see how that's achieved, or how the customer wants to buy the business-wide risk assessment, and how the output from the customer risk assessment feeds back in to the BWRA. And that sort of thing. And it would also look to see that the methodology for transaction monitoring is aligned to the risks as set out in the business-wide risk assessment. I refer to it as the BWRA. There would be, other firms might refer to it as an enterprise-wide risk assessment, an EWRA, but one way or the other, it's the business level, but it is intended to actually drive a lot of the activity in the business and a lot of the way in which the firm thinks about risk. And it is expected to be approved by the board, or should I say challenged and approved by the board and reviewed periodically and updated as needs be. So it's a really important part of the process. I mentioned transaction monitoring briefly in the context of the business-wide risk assessment, but look, we saw the central bank's bulletin on that, and we know it's an area of focus, and it will make more sense when we talk about the European framework and how that landscape is evolving as well. But really the focus in terms of identifying potential suspicious activity, identifying criminal activity, using the information that you have available to you as a financial institution to be able to identify flags and alerts and things that you might deem to be unusual. You're expected to have a handle on that as a financial institution, and to automate that to the extent that that's necessary and warranted by risk. So that's another important area of focus. Beneficial ownership. It's not for no reason that these rules have changed. The perception out there is that if you don't know who the underlying owner of the investment is, then how can you have an effective financial crime framework? How can you follow the flow of money? How can you get to the individual who's behind all of this if there is criminal activity? And so there's a good reason why that's been front and centre for the last while, and I think it will continue to be front and centre for a while. It's a bit like the third-party reliance and the intermediary relationships. You need to know who you're dealing with, you know. And we've had, because the regulation has been evolving over the years, and we've taken interpretation with regard to the difference between a true third party and an intermediary relationship, a nominee entity acting on behalf of a financial institution who happens to be the custodian for another regulated entity, et cetera, and this chain of regulated entities, particularly in the investment fund sector, has always been really relevant. And I guess from a risk management perspective, there is that expectation that you at least need to understand what that relationship is before you can truly assess the risk and then apply the appropriate level of due diligence. So, and I've definitely seen firms taking a more conservative approach to that over the years. From an EU perspective then, I mean, this is where, and I know I'm probably a bit of a geek when it comes to all of this, but this is where for me it gets really interesting, right? So the EU are saying, look, we know we've had, like most of the legislation that we've had in place now for some time has been driven by EU directives, and almost that was an attempt to create a single rule book. But the perception is that it didn't create a single rule book because we still have a lot of divergent practices between EU member states. And we know this in the funds industry because we're always compared to Luxembourg. And you know, the ease with which somebody might open an account there compared to here, and it's a bit of a myth, right? Because the standard is fundamentally the same across the EU, but there has been a divergence in how some of the rules have been implemented. So at an EU Commission level, they want to change that. They want to get us all consistently applying the same standards in the same way, which I think is going to be helpful, but it's going to take quite a while for that to happen, I would say. And they're proposing a single supervisor, and like they have been busy issuing guidelines on the role of supervisors, and you know, we've got a very strong AML supervisory team within the central bank in Ireland. They're very practiced in what they do, and they're very consistent, and so the move to a single supervisor will change some of that dynamic, but I expect it would probably be a hub and spoke model, a bit like the single supervisory mechanism that's in place for significant financial institutions. That's not easy to say, but a bit like that, where there would be a central entity in Europe with responsibility for ensuring that a consistent approach to supervision is applied across the EU. Effectively, that's what it's going to be there for. And then the more interesting part is, I mean, there needs to be greater cooperation between the financial intelligence units, and that's probably going to require a look at the data protection legislation that's in place. Probably needs to be another look at legislation generally across the EU to bring about greater cooperation between the public and private sectors on this. The intention behind all of this is to look at the flow of money. There's two things that are really interesting concepts, which I hear more and more through speeches by regulators and policymakers. One is the de-risking of the financial sector in the EU, i.e. taking the risk out of it by excluding certain cohorts of customers or certain geographies by having access to the financial system here. That would take a long time to bring about. That's not an easy thing to do. And the other one is the breaking down of borders. And Dermot Rowland mentioned it in a speech recently, where she said borders are not barriers to criminals, and therefore, and I'm ad-libbing, therefore they shouldn't be barriers to financial investigations either. And that's where this is heading. So greater cooperation between EU member states, between financial institutions, between the public and private sectors, and generally getting to the root of the risk to try and take that risk out of the financial system altogether.